Thank you, Prof. Hefner. In quite a brief time, Prof. Hefner mentioned about, clarified in more detail about post-Islamism and the contesting political Islam discourse at the current time. I would like to invite Dr. Zainal Bagir as the second speaker to talk about the topic. Thanks.
Ya, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you. I probably will also make very brief notes, shorter than what Bob Hefner has mentioned, and looking forward to our discussion. But I'll start with, as Bob mentioned, looking at post-Islamism as a moment in which there is a realization that Islamism, or the capture Islamist effort to capture the state, has failed, and people are looking at different alternatives. So that moment, I think, is also helped by the realization which is reflected in, for example, in the among scholars on the rethinking of secularism. Sorry. So there is a whole genre of literature, actually not only genre, rethinking secularism, a number of books with the identical title, Rethinking Secularism. So this rethinking has been going on in many places, reflecting experiences of many countries in the world, including in India, for example. There has been for a long time a rethinking about what secularism means in India, but also in many other Muslim countries, in Indonesia, Turkey, Iran, and others. I think it's very important to look at what options are available when we see this rethinking of secularism. So one of the first things is the realization that actually secularization as a sociological thesis, for example, Peter Berger, who was the former director of CURA, basically he revised his thesis about secularization, looking at that secularization actually was not a rule but exception. In most places in the world, secularization understood as, well, probably in a simple way, marginalization of religion from the public space. That actually did not happen. It happened only in very few parts of the world, very few countries in Western Europe. So it's more an exception than a rule. In most places, actually religion has as strong presence today as in the past. So religion has always been there, and we should not wish, or, well, probably this is wishful thinking, that there is one point that religion can go away and then everything will be better, the state will be better for everyone, etc., which I think was also one of the motivation of the early Islamism. But looking at this phenomenon of desecularization, basically, that's the title of Peter Berger's a book which he edited, that the phenomenon is actually the desecularization of the world. There are many options open to struggle for the aspirations of, we can just say, of Sharia, for example, understood in broader way as public ethics. So there are ways other than capturing the state, to make sure that each Muslim can be a good Muslim as he or she wishes. So it does not need a state to make me a better Muslim. For example, another figure which Bob has mentioned also, who passed away a few days ago, Alfred Stepan, a political scientist, he spoke about multiple secularism, that even secularism, it doesn't have only one meaning. There is a separatist secularism in France, which is different from secularism in the United States, which is different from secularism in other Western European countries. And there are more models actually of secularism. So even if we want to still use the term secularism, we should use the term multiple secularism. And some types of secularism, it doesn't necessitate strict separation of religion and state. So there is not a high wall, but you can actually, if I use not a very nice word, you can breach, or religion can breach the state to make sure that their aspiration is incorporated there, without the Islamist effort of capturing the state. Alfred Stepan also has this idea of twin toleration, that instead of speaking about secularism, we should speak about twin toleration, in which the state gives freedom to religion. The state is not anti-religion. The state may even accommodate religion. And the other side of the toleration is religion gives space also to the state, not trying to influence the state. Why? Because what can influence the state should only be those who are elected. So the main loyalty here is not to secularism. Secularism is not the most important thing, but what we can see in figures like Alfred Stepan, Ahmed Kuru, and many others, is a strong commitment to democracy, not to secularism. And democracy does not necessitate strict secularism. So loyalty to democracy, like we have discussed yesterday, it has risk. Democracy is not a cure of all diseases. It has risk. We have seen in many states in transition to democracy, there were violence, there were instability, etc. So it has risk. But for some arguments, we can argue that it's probably the best type of government. And again, while democracy does not necessitate secularism, and religion can try to influence the state, it should also leave the state free. I mean, not enforcing religion. So one Muslim thinker which immediately came to my mind when I think about this is Abdullahi An-Naim from Sudan. His book Islam and the Secular State is probably in the beginning very provocative, but actually he has very sensible and I think strong, well thought idea. So the first sentence which I always remember from his book, Islam and the Secular State, is that to be a good Muslim, I need a secular state. And then he explains why. Because Islam has diverse tradition. So this is how one of the argument, his argument runs. In the whole history of Islamic tradition, there's always diversity. People can choose. People have freedom to choose, like, for example, this madhab or other madhab, and depending on the context, depending on many other things. But when you want the state to enforce Islam, somehow, in one way or another, you have to reduce the diversity. You have to reduce the richness of the Islamic tradition and enforce like for example one version of Islam. So an Islamic state, rather than giving benefit to Muslims, actually it really disadvantaged Muslim more than non-Muslims. Why it disadvantaged Muslim? Because it takes away Muslims' religious freedom. That is the freedom to be a good Muslim in a way in which he or she believes. Because again, this is what he said, to be a good Muslim, I have to believe in Islam as I understand it, and there is no compulsion to religion. I can only internalize an understanding of Islam which I really believe in. So he does not want the state to take away that freedom. So this is a different way of thinking of how the relation between the state and religious believers and religion. And I think it opens up a number of, again, more options of how people try to be a good Muslim in a democratic context. Bob also mentioned a very the result of the Pew poll in the Muslim world a few years ago, which basically shows that there is a very strong commitment among Muslims to democracy, but at the same time there is also a very strong commitment among Muslims to Sharia. So Sharia cannot be out of the picture, but two things or 2 points which we have to remember. First, that Sharia is diverse. Sharia should not be understood only in a very narrow way. Sharia is not only hudud. Sharia is much broader. Sharia is about justice, it's about ethics. And then secondly, so the understanding of the Sharia, and secondly, how Sharia can be implemented. So Islamism is trying to capture the state to implement Sharia, and it failed. It didn't work. So we have to think about a broader understanding of Sharia and a better relationship between Sharia and the state. And as I said, there are many options about that. So just one last point. There are a number of among the options, like for example the one given by Abdullahi An-Naim. He thought that what I mentioned earlier as loyalty to democracy, not secularism. He elaborates that in a bit more detailed way, mentioning three main issues: constitutionalism, citizenship or equal citizenship, and human rights. So these are the three things in which our thinking about Sharia should be framed. About constitutionalism and equal citizenship, probably that's not the most controversial. About human rights, there is still controversy, even among the Muslims, asking whether human rights is compatible with Islam or not. But again, the debate has been going a long way. And even if you see now the Organization of Islamic Conference, which 2 decades ago they made Cairo Declarations of Islamic, the Islamic Declaration of Human Rights. Now their idea is not to develop a particular kind of Islamic human rights, but join this global movement of human rights and make the countries under the OIC as part of this global human rights commitment. So I think in 2012, if I'm not mistaken, OIC created a new Office of Human Rights Commission. There's a long name of this commission. They've been thinking about, well, they have not taken up more controversial topics like freedom of expression and others, but they have taken up issues like children and women, human rights related to children and women, and it's new. It's only only 5 years old. It's still working, but I think what is important in seeing this phenomenon is that the movement, the convergence of movement. That is, whether in the past, even when thinking about human rights, they think about Islamic human rights. Now they want to go together under this big umbrella of universal human rights and work within this system to make improvement. So I think this type of convergence, probably it goes in parallel with post-Islamism, putting Muslims or Islam within the global commitment of improvement of human condition. I think that's probably a more interesting prospect to be looking at. Well, thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.